The late afternoon sun bathed the street in a golden glow as Emily and Mark stood before their new home. A Victorian fixer-upper nestled in the heart of a gentrifying neighborhood. The house, with its intricate woodwork and towering gables, had seen better days. Paint peeled from the siding, and the windows were clouded with grime, but to Emily, it was a canvas waiting to be restored. As an architect, she saw potential in every cracked beam and sagging porch, her mind already sketching out renovations that would turn this relic into a masterpiece. Mark, standing beside her with a box of their belongings, smiled at her enthusiasm. A history teacher with a love for the past. He was drawn to the house's vintage charm, the stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns on the floor, the ornate banister that curved up to the second story, and the faint scent of aged wood that lingered in the air. "It's got character," he said, nudging Emily playfully. "A little TLC, and it'll be perfect." Emily grinned, her eyes sparkling with ambition. "More than a little, but yes. We'll make it ours and then some. This place will be worth a fortune once we're done." The neighborhood itself was a blend of old and new. Sleek condos rose beside century-old homes, and trendy cafes dotted the streets where once only corner stores stood. It was a place in transition, and Emily and Mark felt like pioneers, staking their claim in a corner of the city poised for revival. Their neighbors seemed to share the sentiment, offering warm smiles and helping hands as the couple unloaded their moving truck. Mrs. Alvarez from next door, a kind-faced woman with silver-streaked hair, brought over a plate of homemade cookies. "Welcome to the block," she said, her voice rich with a faint accent. "This street's got a lot of history. You'll find it's unique." Mark thanked her, but Emily caught a fleeting shadow in the woman's eyes, a hesitation before she turned away. "Unique how?" Emily asked, curiosity piqued. Mrs. Alvarez waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, old places like this have stories. Nothing to worry about. Just respect the house, and it'll respect you." The comment lingered in Emily's mind as she and Mark began unpacking. The house creaked and groaned, as if settling under the weight of its new occupants. Every room held a surprise, a hidden alcove, a forgotten fireplace, or a patch of wallpaper that peeled back to reveal another layer beneath. It was a treasure trove of possibilities, and Emily's excitement grew with each discovery. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the overgrown garden, Emily decided to tackle the weeds choking the flower beds. She knelt in the dirt, her hands working methodically, when her fingers brushed against something hard. She dug deeper, unearthing a small, tarnished locket. Its surface was etched with intricate symbols, worn smooth by time. Emily wiped away the grime, revealing a delicate clasp. She pried it open, but the inside was empty, save for a faint, musty smell. "Look at this," she called to Mark, who was hauling boxes into the house. He ambled over, peering at the locket in her palm. Probably belonged to someone who lived here before. Cool find." Emily traced the symbols with her thumb. These markings, they're unusual, almost like runes or something. Mark shrugged, his interest waning. "Maybe it's just decorative. We can clean it up, see if it's worth anything." But Emily felt a strange pull toward the locket, as if it held a story waiting to be told. She slipped it into her pocket, intending to research it later. As she did, a faint breeze rustled the leaves overhead, carrying with it a whisper so soft it might have been her imagination. Inside, the house was a maze of half-unpacked boxes and furniture draped in sheets. The couple worked late into the night, the creak of floorboards and the occasional clatter of tools the only sounds breaking the silence. By the time they collapsed into bed, the house felt less like a stranger and more like a project they could conquer together. Yet, as Emily drifted off to sleep, the locket tucked safely in a drawer. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching them. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch just a little too far, and the air held a faint, earthy scent that hadn't been there before. She dismissed it as fatigue, but deep down, a sliver of unease took root. In the days that followed, the couple threw themselves into renovations, their laughter and chatter filling the once silent rooms. The neighbors continued to be friendly, though their comments about the area's unique past became a recurring, if cryptic, refrain. Emily and Mark brushed it off, too caught up in their plans to pay it much mind. But the locket, now polished and resting on the mantel, seemed to catch the light in odd ways, its symbols glinting as if alive. And sometimes, when the house was quiet, Emily thought she heard a faint, rhythmic tapping from the basement, like the sound of bones against wood. She told herself it was just the house settling, but the unease lingered, a quiet whisper in the back of her mind. Little did they know, the dream home they had so eagerly claimed was built on restless grounds, and the spirits beneath were beginning to stir. 2 weeks had passed since Emily and Mark moved into their Victorian fixer-upper, and the house was slowly coming to life. The living room walls, once a faded yellow, now glowed with a fresh coat of pale blue paint. The ornate banister, sanded and polished, gleamed in the afternoon light filtering through dusty windows. Emily wiped sweat from her brow, her hands rough from days of labor, but she smiled at their progress. Mark, balanced on a ladder, taped the crown molding with precision. "This is starting to feel like ours," Emily said, stepping back to admire the room. Mark grinned. "Told you we'd make it work, though my back's begging for a break." Emily laughed, but her smile faltered as she reached for her paintbrush and found it gone. "Hey, where's my brush?" "It was right here." Mark glanced down. "Maybe you left it somewhere." "No, I was just using it." She searched the cluttered room, then stopped. There it was on the mantel, next to the tarnished locket they'd dug up in the garden. How did it get there? Mark shrugged. "You probably set it down. We're both exhausted." Emily frowned but let it slide. Maybe she had misplaced it. That night, the house creaked around them, its old bones settling into the darkness. Emily jolted awake, her heart racing. Soft whispers filled the room, a murmur of voices in a language she couldn't grasp. They seemed to seep from the walls, faint but persistent. She shook Mark. "Do you hear that?" He mumbled, half asleep. "Hear what?" "The voices. It's like people talking." He listened, then sighed. "It's the wind, Em. Old houses make noises." But Emily lay still, the whispers echoing in her mind long after they faded. The next morning she opened the kitchen cabinet for a mug and froze. The locket sat among the cups, its chain coiled neatly. She'd left it on the mantel, she was sure of it. "Mark, did you move this?" He looked up from his laptop. "No, maybe it fell in there when we unpacked." "It didn't," she said, her voice tight. "I didn't put it here." Mark chuckled. "What, you think it's haunted?" Emily didn't laugh. That night, her dreams took her to the garden. She stood on the cool grass, moonlight casting jagged shadows. A figure emerged, its face hidden, but its clothing bore intricate patterns like those on the locket. It reached out, urging her closer. She woke breathless, the image lingering. The next day, she ventured into the basement, a damp, shadowy space they'd barely touched. The air smelled of earth, and cobwebs clung to the rafters. In one corner stood an old mirror, its frame ornate but worn, its glass dulled by time. She wiped it clean, then gasped. For a moment, her reflection wasn't hers. It was a Native American woman, her eyes heavy with grief. Then the mirror shattered, glass raining onto the floor. Emily stumbled back, her scream echoing. Mark rushed down the stairs. "What happened?" "It broke by itself," she said, trembling. He studied the shards. "It was probably cracked already. Old glass does that." But Emily couldn't shake the woman's face. Later that week, they visited a local cafe for a break. There, they met Mr. Thompson, a retired historian with kind eyes. He spoke warmly about the neighborhood's changes, then leaned in. "This area has a past, you know. Rumors say it was sacred to the Native Americans, maybe even a burial ground." Mark smirked. "Sounds like a ghost story." Mr. Thompson laughed. "Just local tales, I suppose." Emily's stomach twisted. Back home, she couldn't hold it in. Mark the brush, the whispers, the locketits, all strange. And now this burial ground talk. He hugged her. "It's an old house, Em. Things move. The wind plays tricks. That story's probably nonsense." She nodded, wanting to believe him. But that night, the whispers returned, louder, sharper. She clutched the locket now on her nightstand, whispered, "What do you want?" In her dream, the figure pointed to the garden earth, its voice clear. "Give back what is ours." Emily woke, the words burning in her mind. Their dream home was no longer just theirs. Something ancient was stirring beneath it. The library was a sanctuary of quiet, its shelves heavy with the scent of old paper and polished wood. Emily and Mark sat at a long table, surrounded by stacks of books and microfiche slides, their faces drawn with fatigue and unease. The strange occurrences in their home, the whispers, the locket's eerie movements. The shattered mirror had driven them to seek answers. Mr. Thompson's mention of a Native American burial ground had lodged itself in Emily's mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the house's disturbances were tied to something far older than its Victorian bones. Mark flipped through a tome on local history, his brow furrowed. This says the neighborhood was built in the late 1800s, after the city expanded. Nothing about burial grounds. Emily, scanning a faded map, pointed to their street. Here. This area was undeveloped until the 1870s. Before that, it was tribal land. Mark leaned closer, his skepticism softening. So maybe there's truth to the rumors. A librarian approached, her glasses perched on her nose, finding everything you need. Emily hesitated, then asked, "Do you have records of Native American sites in this area?" The librarian nodded. "We have a section on indigenous history. Follow me." She led them to a corner of the library, where dusty volumes and archival boxes awaited. Emily's heart quickened as she opened a file labeled Tribal Lands and Relocation. Inside were newspaper clippings, treaties, and maps detailing the forced removal of Native Americans from the region. One article caught her eye. "Sacred grounds desecrated for urban growth." Mark read over her shoulder. It says the city built over ancient burial sites without relocating the remains. The tribes protested, but it was too late. Emily's stomach churned. "So our house? It's on top of a graveyard?" Mark's face paled. "It can't be right. It wouldn't just build over graves." But the evidence was clear. Emily pulled out another document, a handwritten letter from a tribal elder dated 1875. "The spirits will not rest. The land remembers, and it will demand respect." A chill ran down her spine. The words echoed the whispers she'd heard in the night, the figure in her dreams demanding, "Give back what is ours." Back home, the house felt different, live almost. The air was thick, the shadows deeper. Emily clutched the locket, now warm in her hand, and pried it open again. This time she noticed a faint outline inside, like a photo had been there once. She held it to the light, and for a moment she saw a Native American woman, her eyes piercing, her expression sorrowful. Then it was gone, the locket empty once more. "Mark, look at this," she said, her voice trembling. He squinted at the locket. "I don't see anything." Emily's frustration grew. It was their woman's face, I swear. Mark sighed, his patience thinning. "Maybe we're letting this get to us. It's an old house, old stories. We can't lose our heads." But that night, as they lay in bed, the disturbances escalated. The bedroom door slammed shut on its own, the lock clicking into place. Emily jolted upright, her heart racing. "Mark." He fumbled for the light, but it wouldn't turn on. The room plunged into darkness, the air growing icy. Then, a soft, rhythmic tapping began from the walls, the floor, everywhere. It was as if the house were alive, its pulse quickening. Emily grabbed her phone, its screen casting a weak glow. "We need to get out of here," but the door wouldn't budge. Mark pounded on it, shouting, but the wood held fast. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it became a cacophony of knocks, like 100 hands demanding entry. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The door creaked open, revealing an empty hallway. Emily and Mark stumbled out, their breaths ragged. But the horror wasn't over. In the garden, the soil heaved as if something beneath was pushing upward. Emily watched in terror as the earth split, revealing glimpses of bone and cloth. The spirits were no longer content to whisper. They were clawing their way to the surface. Mark grabbed her arm. "We need help. This is beyond us." The next morning, they returned to the library, desperate for answers. They found a book on Native American rituals, detailing how to appease disturbed spirits. But the rites were complex, requiring offerings and respect for the land. As they left, Emily spotted the elderly Native American neighbor, Mrs. Nez, tending her garden. She approached cautiously. "Mrs. Nez, we need your help. Our house sits built on a burial ground. Spirits are angry." Mrs. Nez's eyes narrowed. You've awakened them. They demand respect. What can we do? Mark asked. She handed Emily a bundle of sage. Burn this. Speak words of apology. But it may not be enough. The land remembers. That night, Emily lit the sage, its smoke curling through the house. She whispered apologies, her voice trembling. But the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. Spirits were not appeased, they were enraged. In her dreams, the woman from the locket appeared again, her voice clear. You must give back what is ours, or pay the price. Emily woke, the words searing her mind. The house was no longer theirs. It belonged to the restless dead, and they would not be denied. The Victorian house, once a symbol of Emily and Mark's dreams, had become a nightmare. The air inside was thick with a cold that seeped into their bones, and the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The sage Mrs. Nez had given them lay burned out on the floor. Its smoke long dissipated, but the spirits were far from appeased. If anything, the disturbances had grown more violent, as if the house itself was rejecting them. Emily sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she clutched a mug of tea that had gone cold. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep, and her mind raced with the events of the past few days. The whispers had turned into wails, the shadows into figures that moved just out of sight. And the garden soil continued to churn, exposing more fragments of bone and cloth. Mark paced the room, his face drawn with worry and frustration. We can't keep living like this, he said, his voice tight. We need to leave, sell the house, cut our losses. Emily shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. We can't. They won't let us. The spirits, they're tied to this land, and now they're tied to us. Mark stopped pacing, his eyes meeting hers. What do you mean? Emily's gaze drifted to the locket on the table, its tarnished surface glinting in the dim light. The woman in my dreams, she keeps saying we have to give back what's theirs. I think she means the locket, or maybe something else. If we don't, they'll never leave us alone. Mark's jaw clenched. So, what? We just hand over a piece of jewelry and hope they go away? That's insane, Mem. But Emily's resolve hardened. We have to try. We can't fight them. They're too strong. That night, the house was unnaturally quiet, the silence more unnerving than the usual disturbances. Emily and Mark lay in bed, their bodies tense, waiting for the inevitable. Then it began a low, rhythmic drumming that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It grew louder, faster, until it was a cacophony of beats, shaking the bed frame. Emily sat up, her heart pounding. Mark, do you hear that? He nodded, his face pale. It's like war drums. The drumming reached a fever pitch, and then the apparitions appeared. Ghostly figures materialized around the room, warriors with painted faces, elders with stern expressions, and children with eyes too old for their years. Their forms were translucent, but their presence was overwhelming, their eyes burning with accusation. Emily clutched the locket, her voice trembling. We're sorry. We didn't know. Please, tell us what you want. One figure stepped forward, a tall warrior with a headdress of feathers. His voice echoed in their minds, deep and resonant. You have desecrated our resting place. You must make amends. Mark, his voice shaking, asked, How? What do we need to do? The warrior's gaze was unyielding. Return what was taken. Honor the land, or face our wrath. The apparitions vanished, leaving the room in silence once more. Emily and Mark exchanged a look of desperation. They knew they had to act, but the path forward was unclear. The next day they returned to the library, poring over books on Native American rituals and traditions. They found references to offering sage tobacco, prayers, but nothing seemed sufficient for the scale of their problem. Emily's frustration grew, her mind clouded with fear and exhaustion. That evening, as they sat in the living room, the house began to shake violently. Furniture slid across the floor, and the walls cracked, plaster raining down. Emily screamed, clinging to Mark as the floorboards buckled beneath them. The spirits were no longer content to haunt, they were attacking. In the midst of the chaos, Emily's eyes fell on the locket, now glowing with an unearthly light. She grabbed it, her hands steady despite the turmoil. We have to bury it, she said, her voice firm. In the garden, where we found it. Maybe that's what they want. Mark nodded, his face set with determination. Together, they braved the shaking house and stumbled into the garden. The soil was churned and uneven, bones and relics poking through the earth. Emily knelt, digging a small hole with her hands, and placed the locket inside. She covered it with dirt, whispering a prayer she'd found in one of the books. For a moment, the shaking stopped, and the air grew still. Emily and Mark held their breath, hoping against hope that it was over. But then the ground erupted, and a figure rose from the earth, a skeletal warrior. Its bones adorned with feathers and beads, its hollow eyes fixed on them, and it let out a bone-chilling scream. Emily and Mark scrambled back, their hearts racing. The warrior advanced, its bony fingers outstretched, and behind it, more spirits emerged from the soil, their forms twisted with rage. "We did what you asked," Emily cried, her voice breaking. "We returned the locket." The warrior's voice echoed in their minds, cold and unforgiving. "It is not enough. The land demands more." Mark pulled Emily to her feet, his eyes wide with terror. "Run." They fled into the house, slamming the door behind them, but the spirits followed, their presence filling the rooms with a suffocating dread. The couple barricaded themselves in the bedroom, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. "We need help," Mark said, his voice trembling. "We can't do this alone." Emily nodded, her mind racing. Mrs. Ness, she might know what to do. But as they reached for their phones, the lights flickered and died, plunging the house into darkness. The spirits' wails grew louder, and the walls began to close in, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. In the darkness, Emily felt a hand on her shoulder, cold and bony. She screamed, but the hand tightened, pulling her into the shadows. Mark's voice called out, desperate and afraid, but it was drowned out by the spirit's fury. The house was no longer a home, it was a tomb, and the spirits of the Restless Grounds were claiming their due. The bedroom door splintered as the spirit's relentless assault shattered the barricade. Emily and Mark scrambled back, their hearts pounding in unison, but there was nowhere left to hide. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the walls seemed to close in, pulsing with a malevolent energy. Shadows writhed in the corners, taking form warriors with hollow eyes, elders with accusing stares, and children whose mournful wails cut through the chaos. "Run," Mark shouted, grabbing Emily's hand and pulling her toward the hallway. They stumbled over debris, the floorboards buckling beneath their feet as the house groaned like a living thing. The spirits followed, their forms flickering in and out of existence, their voices a cacophony of rage and sorrow. Emily's mind raced, her thoughts a jumble of fear and desperation. She remembered Mrs. Nez's warning. The spirits demanded respect and reparations. Returning the locket hadn't been enough. They needed something more, something that truly honored the land and the dead. But what? The couple fled down the stairs, the spirits' icy breath on their necks. The living room was a wreck, furniture overturned, and the walls cracked as if the house itself was tearing apart. Emily's eyes darted to the basement door, slightly ajar. "Down there," she gasped. "Maybe we can find something answers." Mark hesitated, but the spirits were closing in, their skeletal hands reaching out. With no other choice, they bolted for the basement, slamming the door behind them. The darkness below was suffocating, the air heavy with the smell of mold and something ancient. Their flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing cobwebs and forgotten relics of the house's past. In the far corner, half hidden by a pile of rotting crates, was a small, hidden door. Emily pushed it open, revealing a cramped room filled with dusty artifacts, feather headdresses, pottery shards, and yellowed documents. At the center of the room was a small table, and on it a leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age. Mark grabbed the journal, flipping it open with trembling hands. "It's from a previous owner," he said, his voice shaky. "Listen to this. The spirits are restless. They demand the return of their sacred relic, stolen by the settlers. I've tried to appease them with offerings, but it's not enough. The relic must be whole again." Emily's breath caught. The locket was part of something bigger. Mark turned the page, revealing a sketch of a ceremonial necklace, with the locket as its centerpiece, surrounded by smaller charms. "We need to find the rest of it," he said, his voice urgent. But the house shook violently, the walls cracking as the spirit's fury mounted. Emily glanced at the artifacts around them, her heart sinking. It could be anywhere. We don't have time. Then, she spotted a small, intricately carved box tucked beneath the table. She pried it open, revealing several small, bone-like charms, each etched with symbols matching the locket. "This is it," she whispered, hope flickering in her chest. Mark nodded, grabbing the box. "We have to get to the garden. That's where we found the locket. That's where we need to bury the whole relic." They raced back up the stairs, the spirit's wails echoing behind them. The house was disintegrating, chunks of plaster falling from the ceiling, the floor splitting open. Emily and Mark dodged the debris, their lungs burning as they burst into the garden. The soil was churned and uneven, bones and relics jutting from the earth like accusations. Emily knelt, digging frantically with her hands, while Mark assembled the relic, attaching the charms to the locket. The ground trembled, and a chasm began to open, threatening to swallow them whole. "Hurry," Emily cried, her voice barely audible over the spirit's shrieks. Mark finished, handing her the completed necklace. She placed it into the hole, covering it with dirt, her hands shaking. "Please," she whispered, "take this offering. We're sorry for what was done. Let the land be at peace." For a moment the shaking stopped, and the air grew still. The spirit's forms wavered, their eyes softening. Emily and Mark held their breath, daring to hope. But then the ground split wider, and a skeletal hand emerged, clawing at the earth. "It's not enough," Mark said, his voice breaking. The journal mentioned ritual words of apology in their language. Emily's mind raced. She recalled the dream, the woman's voice speaking in a tongue she didn't understand. "I think I know the words," she said, her voice trembling. She closed her eyes, reciting the phrases from her dream, her pronunciation clumsy but sincere. The spirits paused, their forms flickering. The chasm stopped widening and the hand retreated into the earth. The air warmed slightly, the oppressive weight lifting. Emily and Mark exchanged a glance, relief flooding through them. But then the spirit's leader, the tall warrior, stepped forward, his voice echoing in their minds. "Your words are accepted, but the land demands more. A sacrifice of the heart." Emily's heart sank. What does that mean? The warrior's gaze was unyielding. "Must give up what you hold dear, or the restless will never sleep." Mark's face paled. "Our home? Our dreams?" The warrior nodded, or more. Emily and Mark stood frozen, the weight of the decision crushing them. They had poured their savings, their hopes into this house. But the spirit's demand was clear. To survive, they had to let go. As the ground began to tremble again, Emily made her choice.
"I will leave,"
she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "We'll abandon the house, let the land be as it was." The warrior's eyes softened, and the spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into mist. The house stilled, the cracks in the walls sealing as if by magic. The air cleared, and the oppressive cold lifted. But as the last spirit vanished, the warrior's voice lingered in their minds. "The land will remember your sacrifice. But beware, some debts are never fully paid." Emily and Mark stood in the garden, the relic buried, their future uncertain. They had survived, but at a cost. The house was no longer theirs, and the spirits, though appeased, were not entirely gone. The Restless Grounds would always hold a piece of them, a reminder of the price of disrespecting the past. The garden of the Victorian house was a battlefield of churned earth and exposed bones, the air heavy with the scent of damp soil and sage. Emily and Mark stood at the edge of a widening chasm, its depths dark and endless, as the spirit's presence pressed against them. The warrior's words echoed in their minds. The land demands more, sacrifice of the heart. The house behind them groaned, its walls splintering, as if urging them to decide before it collapsed entirely. Emily's hands trembled, still clutching the earth where she had buried the completed ceremonial necklace. Her whispered apologies, spoken in the dream language, had briefly calmed the spirits. But their leader's demand lingered like a weight on her chest. She looked at Mark, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear and determination. "We can't give up the house," Mark said, his voice breaking. "It's everything we've worked for, our future." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It's not worth our lives. We have to let it go." But the ground shook harder, the chasm widening, its edges crumbling beneath their feet. The spirits reappeared, their forms more solid now, warriors with clenched fists. Elders with stern gazes, children with mournful eyes. Their leader, the tall warrior, stepped forward, his presence towering over them. "The land was stolen," he said, his voice resonating in their bones. "Your sacrifice must match the theft." Emily's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of her dreams and the journal's cryptic words. The spirits didn't just want the house, they wanted something deeper, something personal. She glanced at the locket's burial spot, now swallowed by the chasm, and a realization hit her. The sacrifice wasn't just material, it was emotional, a piece of their very selves. "Mark," she whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos. "It's us. We have to give something of ourselves, something we hold dear." Mark's eyes widened. "What are you saying?" Emily took his hand, her heart pounding. I think it's about guilt, love, our past. We have to offer something real." The warrior's gaze softened, but his voice was unyielding. "Choose quickly, or the land will take all." Emily closed her eyes, her mother's face flashing in her mind, the guilt she carried for not being there when she died. She pulled a small knife from her pocket, a keepsake from her mother, and pricked her finger. Blood welled up, and she let it drip onto the ground, her voice trembling as she spoke in the dream language. "I'm sorry," she said, addressing both the spirits and her mother's memory. "I give my guilt, my pain. Let it rest with you." The earth stilled for a moment, the spirits' forms flickering. But the chasm didn't close, and the warrior's eyes narrowed. "Wait, more," he demanded. Mark's face hardened. He thought of his own insecurities, the fear of never being enough for Emily, for himself. He stepped closer to the chasm, his hands shaking. "I'll give it up," he said, his voice raw. "My doubt, my fear. Take it." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a worn photograph of himself as a boy, standing alone, a reminder of the rejection he'd always carried. It tossed it into the chasm, and it vanished into the darkness. The spirits' wails softened, their forms fading, but the ground trembled again, the chasm widening. Emily realized with a sinking heart that it still wasn't enough. The spirits wanted a final offering, one that would bind them to the land forever. "Mark, no," she cried, sensing his intent. But Mark was already moving, stepped to the edge of the chasm, his eyes locked on hers. "I love you," he said, his voice steady. "Get out. Live." Before she could stop him, he let himself fall, disappearing into the abyss with a cry that echoed in her soul. The ground shook violently, then stilled. The spirits vanished, their presence lifting like a weight removed. The chasm closed, the garden smoothing over, as if nothing had happened. Emily fell to her knees, sobbing, her hands clawing at the earth. The house behind her was silent, its cracks sealed, its air warm once more, but Mark was gone. In the weeks that followed, Emily finished the renovations alone, her movements mechanical. She buried the locket in charms deeper in the garden, offering daily prayers in the dream language. The spirits remained quiet, their wrath appeased, and the house was transformed into the masterpiece she'd envisioned. She sold it, unable to stay in a place that held so much loss. But at night, as she lay in her new apartment, she heard a faint, anguished voice calling her name from far below. It was Mark, trapped in the Restless Grounds, his sacrifice binding him to the land forever. Emily never returned to the house. She carried the weight of his loss, a debt she could never repay. The spirits were at peace, but the land remembered, and so did she. Nights she woke with the taste of earth in her mouth, and she wondered if the Restless Grounds would ever truly let her go.